Welcome to Behind the Book. It's time now for Behind the Book, hosted by Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion, two authors with a passion for books, no filters, and limitless curiosity. Join them now to find out the real story behind your favorite books and authors. And now, Behind the Book.
Welcome to another episode of Behind the Book. I'm here with my co-host Karen, and we just had a wonderful interview with our guest today. But before we get into that, how are things with you?
Things are great. And you know what? I've been wanting to talk to you anyway, because this was the first year, 2021 actually, that I wrote a Christmas novella. And as you know, a lot of our friends have written Christmas novellas. And I've always held back, even though I love Christmas and I love these kinds of books and I love feel-good holiday stories, because I thought it's so limited. I mean, there's only one time a year, one season that's Christmas. But I had this idea and I wrote it, and people really seem to like it. It's really well received and getting great reviews. And I keep waiting for the sales to taper off, and they have, but not completely. I think 2 days ago I made $8 on this Christmas novella, and yesterday I made like $3.50. And I'm just delighted. I'm like, I can't believe people are buying and reading a Christmas novella at the end of March. So I thought I felt really special. And then I looked at the rankings for your Christmas novellas, and they're doing actually even better. So you can tell me, is this a pattern?
Well, I think, I have two theories. One is they have read our other stuff and are like, does she have anything else? And okay, yeah, it's not, November, but I'm going to read one in July. So I think there's part of that. And then I think also just, especially this time when everything is so difficult and we've had such a hard couple of years, I think people are looking for those books that they can tell from the cover or the blurb, like, this is going to make me feel good. It's going to let me escape. And so I think that might be part of it as well.
Looking for the heartwarming amidst the world news.
Exactly.
So do you still get sales in like June, July, August?
Yeah. I don't track it that carefully because they're not, big sellers during those months. But one thing that I've been surprised about is I have this historical series called Castaway Christmas, and I'm going to put one out every year. And they're actually full-length novels, which I don't know why I did that, but it's too late now. Anyway, and I thought, people won't remember from the year before and order the new one, but it did really well. So I think if you enjoy reading them and writing them, I think there's always going to be a market for Christmas books. And who knows, Hallmark could find us. I keep, tweeting them, but so far they haven't called.
If any of our listeners are with Hallmark or are affiliated with Hallmark in any way, shape, and form,
we have perfect novellas.
That's right. Karen and Tess are sitting by the phone waiting for your call.
Anyway, all right, well, we'll go ahead and let everybody listen to Mike Chen. He was great, and we were talking about it with him after the interview. He answered some questions with answers we have never heard before. So I think the listeners will find this interesting. A lot of craft stuff, for sure.
And not only that, he's our very first science fiction author.
Yes, and he did not disappoint. Today, we're very excited to have Mike Chen with us. He is a critically acclaimed science fiction author based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. His debut novel, Here and Now and Then, was a finalist for numerous awards. His other novels include A Beginning at the End, We Could Be Heroes, Light Years from Home, and Star Wars Brotherhood. In previous lives, Mike worked as a sports journalist covering the NHL. He was a DJ, a musician, and an aerospace engineer, a true Renaissance man. He lives with his wife, daughter, and many rescue animals. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We've been very excited to talk with you. Tell us a little bit about your path to publication. Did you always want to be a novelist? All those other things?
Definitely more. Well, I really wanted to be a musician. That was the big thing for me. I have always been like a storyteller of some sorts. Like I drew a lot of my own like comics when I was growing up. Usually they were like fan fiction comics where I would take, characters from this franchise and they met the characters from this franchise and they hung out. And around high school, I learned that like I understood prose pretty well and I understood voice. And there were like a few different moments in like different classes where I'd be working on a project and it just felt like, okay, I can do this. I get this. And it was really in college. I didn't take creative writing until my senior year, but I knew every time I had to write an essay or a technical paper or something like that, like it came really easily. And I would edit, like if I was doing a group engineering project and we had to turn in like the report, like I would always edit the report for my team because I just understood it. They don't have a technical theater minor at UC Davis, but I took enough classes for it to be a minor, enough acting classes. And I've played music my whole life. So I really thought like, I would be one of those like community theater guys, or I would be playing music or whatever. But when I took creative writing, it was like a lightning bolt went off in my head. I remember telling my teacher at the time that it felt like a freedom that I didn't really have with music or like I did a lot of drawing too. So like music, theater, drawing, all of those are kind of limited by the medium. But with writing, it's like you could do anything as long as your imagination conjures it. And I hadn't experienced that before. And so my teacher at the end of the quarter, I was a senior at this time, and she asked me to change majors. And I was like, I can't do that. My parents have already paid for 3.5 years of engineering school. um, so she said, okay, well, make sure you keep writing because you've wrecked the curve and you clearly get this. And so she told me about like critique groups and other things. And so when I signed with my agent, I looked her up, and she's actually an executive at Simon and Schuster right now. And so I got back in touch with her in 2015. I said like, hey, I took your advice. And, after a detour with sports journalism, I went back to fiction and I got an agent. And so we've stayed in touch since then. And then during the pandemic, she went back to her mom's house where a bunch of her old like teaching stuff was stored. And she found the grade book from my quarter and she sent it to me. And so I have visual proof now that, yes, I did wreck the curve. It was pretty awesome to see.
I can imagine.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And can I ask why science fiction? Why does that connect with you?
It's an interesting thing because I don't write, like if this was 20 years ago, I don't think I would be able to be published because I write, very character driven, like slice of life science fiction. Like my latest Light Years from Home, I often describe it to people as like 10% space opera, 90% family drama. And so I don't think like the industry really accepted that until maybe like on a gradual curve starting about 10 years ago or so. But science fiction has always really been my thing growing up. It's funny because like a lot of video games are either science fiction or they're fantasy. And like the fantasy stuff, like just never really appealed to me that much. But like put a spaceship in there and I'm like, I'm going to play this game. And it's the same thing with like movies and like anime and everything is like, if it has spaceships or, some sci-fi concept in there, like it really, really hooks me. As a reader though, I really, really love interpersonal stuff. Like one of my favorite authors of all time is Nick Hornby. And he was such an influence. I remember the first time I read High Fidelity, like got me into like, oh, I really like this very voicey type of writing. And then when I read About a Boy, that was when I thought like, I want to do something like this. I feel like I can. I love the exploration of the people in here. And so I actually started writing contemporary fiction. I tried to query agents who were writing or who covered commercial fiction and women's fiction. And my critique partner, after my second manuscript, I was like, this isn't working. I'm not happy doing this. I really wish I could just take this and then put it on a spaceship or something like that. And she said, why don't you try that? Because she said, like, at the very, very least, it would make you a better writer. You would have more experience with it. And I'm going to shout her out. Her name is Sierra Godfrey, and her debut, A Very Ordinary Family, comes out this September. So everyone should get that. So she suggested that I do that. And my first manuscript that I tried I joked that it was a post-apocalyptic or about a boy in the apocalypse. It was about a wedding planner and trying to befriend a child after a massive pandemic. And the query itself got a lot of really good responses, but the manuscript did not. So I shelved that. And then the next one I queried was my father-daughter time travel story, Here and Now and Then. And that's what got me my agent, and that's what became my debut. But I should note that the wedding planner in a pandemic story did get released as my second novel after heavy, 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 heavy revisions, because by the time I revised it, I became a much better writer. And I think of all of my work, I still feel like that one is probably, the proverbial book of my heart, because it's been with me through so long, and I've seen those characters evolve in some over 10 years or so. So whenever people, I hear some authors say like, "Oh, I can't pick a favorite." I'm like, yeah, I can. I love those. I love those characters. They were the first ones I really tried to do this with, and I got to evolve them.
So if someone is unfamiliar with your books, is that the one you suggest they start with?
It depends. So that one is the post-pandemic book that came out right before the real pandemic started. So I think like the subject matter is still probably a little touchy for some people. I actually just got an email a few days ago from a reader who said that because they were excited about my Star Wars book that comes out in a few weeks, that they wanted to read some of my other stuff first. And so they picked up a beginning at the end. And they said that they felt like they really needed that, like a hopeful community rebuilding story that takes place after a pandemic. And so it's really nice that I would imagine for a lot of authors who've wrote pandemic books that came out around the pandemic, like is probably not their best selling work. It's definitely not for mine. And I totally understand that, but it's really interesting seeing how it's finding an audience right now. Once people find out that it's not The Stand, it's not The Walking Dead, it's about people who are trying to process what happened to them as they rebuild a community, and then I think a certain type of people are really searching for that right now. I would say like if people are new to my stuff, it's the main thing is there's a really deep focus on character. And so the first one is time travel. That's Here and Now and Then. A beginning at the end is the pandemic one. We Could Be Heroes is superhero best friends. There's no romance in there, and that was very, very intentional. And then Light Years from Home is an X-Files type story about a family breaking apart after an alien abduction. So it's all whatever I think subgenre of sci-fi people preferred. That's probably the best entry for them.
Well, you've talked a little bit already about sort of your genres that you've mixed together.
Mhm.
And it sounds like it's pretty intentional.
Yeah, when the run up was coming to my debut, people asked like, "Do you have a sequel plan for this? Are you going to write more time travel?" And I instantly thought, I don't want to be the time travel guy, and I don't want to write series. And so I kind of made this like mental promise to myself that I'm going to try to hit all of like the science fiction subgenres that I really love. I want something to be different each time. So that's why it's kind of like if you look at my catalog, it's like a Rolodex of science fiction subgenres. At some point, I'm going to run out, and then I'll go back to one of them. But for now, I think I've got a pretty good spread.
I'm curious, why are you not interested in writing a series?
There's two things. One is I don't think the types of stories that I write, I don't think they warrant a series necessarily. Like they're very slice of life, like specific in the moments of these characters' lives. Like when I've been asked, like, is there a sequel coming out to Here and Now and Then? I'm like, no, I wouldn't want to put those characters through anything else. Like they've had a hard enough time. Part of it is also commercial, because I know that typically, I think the estimated formula is like subsequent books sell 2/3 of the prior book, just typically, and I'm like. I think from a career perspective, like my types of stories would have more longevity as standalones. I will say, when I wrote We Could Be Heroes, the last pass that I did with my editor, she said specifically put in more world building to hint that there's a bigger story out there if we ever wanted to go back to it. But her idea was more of, this is a superhero story and it's kind of riffing off comic book tropes. So that would be very in line with that sort of vibe. But I do, from that, I did come up with a few side stories or sequel stories. Like if I ever did want to go back there and if there was the commercial demand for it, I could easily revisit those two wacky best friends.
So, what does a writing day look like for you? And do you outline your books?
A writing day for me in the pandemic also overlaps with my day job and homeschool parenting because my wife is immunocompromised. So we were waiting for my daughter to get vaccinated, and then she got vaccinated, and then Omicron hit. So we have done pretty much a year and 3/4 of homeschool, which is incredibly difficult and like the worst thing ever. Like our kid is like, she's a very social kid, and so she's not built for this. So I get up, I write in the morning, and then we do a mix of like work and school, and then I write at night. And it's funny, I was talking with a friend about like, she's like, wow, you've been incredibly productive during this time, and how are you not burnt out on writing? And it's such an escape for me. It's like every day, like I have, a shouting 7-year-old at me, and I'm dealing with like day job meetings and things like that. And it's like all these like external demands. So when I get to just sit down and write with my characters, it's like I get to escape into another world and not worry about a pandemic or global politics or teaching subtraction to a first grader. It's like I just get to be in my head. And so I think like it's such a pressure release for me that this time has been terrible for me personally, but from a creative productivity perspective, it's actually been pretty good.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And are you an outliner, or do you just?
I
You
think,
are.
I think that's probably how I can do this because I have several friends who, they pants the entire thing until they get to revisions, and they've really struggled during the pandemic because they're like, my brain is just not in it. But for me, I do a 3-act outline once I come up with a concept. And then from there, I do like these layered drafts where I actually write act by act. So I'll write act 1 and I'll do like a skeleton draft that's mostly like dialogue and stage direction. And then that gives me like a feel for the characters and the world. And then I will build on top of that with much better prose. And then I will do another polish round where I feel like I really understand these characters. So I try to make sure that act 1 really, really works first. And then that makes act 2 and act 3 way easier because the more that I build up front, there's less to destroy later on. Like I learned this the hard way when I took the original manuscript for A Beginning at the End, and I had to like completely obliterate it and rebuild it into the direction that my agent wanted to go. And I realized that like doing that when something's not working and you have 100,000 words, it's really hard to like just deconstruct the whole thing. But if you can make sure that everything, like your foundation really, really works and is really heading in the right direction, then the next section is much easier to write. There's so much less discovery that actually has to happen. So I do work in outlines and stages. And I think that under the pandemic, so my friends, Diana Urban and Wendy Hurd, will shout out to them because we have formed like a morning sprint group where it's completely unofficial. We just get on chat and say like, I'm going to go for 20 minutes. And then, one of us will be like, oh, I'm here. I'll go too. And I think the only way I can do that is because I've outlined and I know what I can achieve in 20 minutes or so. If I tried to pants, I don't think that would work at all.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody talk about kind of doing it almost like a screenplay for your first run through. And as a former actress myself, I could see how that would be really helpful because sometimes I really get slowed down with the description. And you know what I mean? It's like it would be great just to, okay, I'm going to put some stage directions and, do the dialogue and then I'll go back. I think I might try that.
So what I do sometimes, like especially if I feel like the prose is really fighting me, because when I write, I'm very visual. I see it in my head. So if I know what I see in my head and I just can't get the words out, I bullet point the remaining
Mm.
parts of the scene. So it's like she walks here, he looks at this, they focus on this, then they argue about this. And so by having those bullet points, I've played out the scene. So I know what's going to happen in detail, like not just from like a log line perspective, but like from a moment by moment perspective. Just the words aren't there yet, and then I can go back to it when my brain is in a better place for writing prose, and then it actually comes together pretty easily. Like when I did the Star Wars book, because that's a really intense, very shortened schedule. And the first thing that happens with that IP is you take a small outline and you expand it into a very, very detailed outline over like 5 or 6 revisions with multiple editors and all the Lucasfilm people like telling you what you can and can't do. And so by the time I actually got to drafting, I had this 20,000 word synopsis and I could break it up into chapter sections. And so each chapter section probably had like 3 to 5 paragraphs of what happens in there. So I was actually able to draft really quickly because I knew exactly where things were going because there was so much work done up front.
Now, with all those people weighing in, did that add stress to it, or was it more like you had additional help with it?
I thought it was because it was all very respectful of like the creative process. And it wasn't like I had expected that they were going to shape the story, and it wasn't that at all. Like they let me pitch a story within parameters. They basically said, like, yes, you can use this, no, you can't use this. And then I had left things both in the synopsis and also in the draft where like, world building details were like I basically just left it open and then they would leave comments about like try to use this character or mention this so we can tie it into this. It was a very collaborative process. I think the speed was the most intimidating thing, but it was way more fun to write than my own books. I mean, it's professional fan fiction. So I remember the first day I sat down to write. I normally on a good day would write like 1,500 to 2,000 words spread across maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours, like broken up into bits throughout the day. But here, the first night I sat down and like my brain just went because I already knew what was going to happen, and I cranked out 6,000 words in like 2.5 hours, and it was so fun that I like looked up at the clock and like it's 11:30. I need to go to bed, and but like I've really every moment that I worked on that book never felt like work. It was just completely like, kids playing with their toys. The worst part about it was trying to find the time to actually work on it, given all of like the overlapping duties. But it was of all of the work that I've done during the pandemic, that was probably the most pressure release. Like I'm having fun doing this instead of watching TV or whatever.
That's so interesting. It seems like it would be the opposite because you'd have the pressure, but it sounds like
I thought
yeah.
so because when I was at a conference and I was talking with another writer who like she had just turned in the manuscript for her Star Wars book, and I asked like, "What's the process?" And she had been a lawyer until her books had taken off, and so she said like, "If I still had my day job, like I don't think I'd be able to do that." And I've pulled this off, and it didn't interfere with my life in any way, and I think that's because it's just the way that my brain works. I think like if I wasn't already accustomed to outlining and then sprinting off of that, like I'd probably be dead. I either would have missed the deadline or I'd be dead. But the fact that like my brain was already kind of set for a process that worked like this, it was just really, really enjoyable.
Have you ever been discouraged during the writing or publication process?
So at the I've been very fortunate that since my debut, I feel, well, outside of the whole pandemic derailing my pandemic book, um, by and large, I feel very supported by my publisher, by my publicist, and my agent, and the community. Like I've met so many people that I call good friends that I talk to like, several times a week on chat and text and stuff, going through like this weird, life as a mid-list author. But when I first started, so I signed with my agent in like summer of 2015, and I had 4 competing offers for the agent, and I thought, like, there's a lot of momentum. It felt really good. I got my first acquisitions offer in December of 2015. So about 2 months after we went on sub, because I did like about 6 weeks of revisions, and I thought, like, oh, this is going to come together faster than I thought. It took 5 attempts at acquisition and 20 months for me to finally get a deal.
Wow.
And the feedback, it was never a question of creative support. It was always the business people at each publisher saying, this is too science fiction for our literary press, or this is too literary for our science fiction press. And I ultimately wound up signing with Mira Books, which is a commercial imprint of HarperCollins. So kind of like straddling the line between them. And it was because the editor really wanted to push into the market of like Station 11 and The Time Traveler's Wife. So that was really discouraging during that time to like get my hopes up and have like I talked with 2 of the 4 editors that failed. Like we talked on the phone about like what would revisions be and what would a potential schedule be. So to get that far and then to have it like explode was extremely discouraging. That's why my agent said, let's look at this old manuscript you have and see if we can focus your energy on rebuilding that, because there's something very interesting here. And that's, I think, the lesson for anyone who's kind of querying or just signed and is working on their debut is you got to start thinking about your next book, because whether or not that first one sells, you need the next one. It just keeps going. It's a machine.
What parts of writing fiction are the easiest for you, and what do you find the most challenging?
Dialogue has always been the easiest thing for me. Ever since I was a kid, I knew how to write snappy dialogue, and I didn't quite understand what voice was from like a technical perspective, but looking back, the books that I liked the best had a strong emphasis on character relationships and voice. And it wasn't, and that was Nick Hornby's book was where I really started to pick up on it from a deconstructing, like, why do I like this so much? So I think like my dialogue has always been really natural, and that actually made writing IP very, very easy. Because one thing that I do when I write an original work is I will cast an actor in the roles. And what that does is like I can hear their voice and I can see their facial expressions. So it makes writing the dialogue way easier. It's just the skill that I have that I can pick up on that really quickly. One thing that I've gotten much better at, but it's still something that I really struggle with, is writing action. And I think like writing my superhero book, because I knew that there were going to be some action sequences in there, I think that really helped me get over the hump. But if you look at my first 2 books, like there's really not that much thriller-y action. It really, and also in my X-Files book, like there's little bits of space opera stuff that's like very intense action in there, and I don't think I could have done that like 5 or 6 years ago.
At what point do you share a work in progress, and who are your first readers?
That's been an evolving question because of just time and deadlines. So the one person that has read everything that I've written, her name is Kat Howard, and she's an award-winning fantasy author, and she's also a freelance editor, and she's, in addition to being super kind, she's very brilliant, and she has 2 very nice cats too. So,
What a great combination!
it is.
Yeah, we love that. Yeah.
I think for everything except for my Star Wars book, because the Star Wars book was, protected by IP legalities and also under this insane deadline. But everything else, I've sent her at least like a first act, and I've sent that. My regular critique partner, Sierra, that I mentioned, her debut's coming up. She's like me, where she has like a day job and she's balancing writing. She's got kids, but because Kat is like, she's a professional editor on top of being an author, like she can provide feedback like with a critical eye much faster. So Kat has seen at least part of everything. The last two things that I sent her partials, like just in Act 1, so about 20,000 words, in a state where like she knows that it's rough, but just to see if it works. And one thing that she actually did for Light Years from Home is she told me that it was not working. And that's the brilliant thing. I tell aspiring writers, find a critique partner that's going to be diplomatically brutal with you. And when Sierra and I exchanged everything, that was the agreement that we had. And we told each other, this is not to be mean. We are doing this because we want each other to become better. Because what I was originally trying to do was to write a present timeline and a past timeline and run them in parallel in alternating chapters and then have them sync up like right when we broke into Act 3. Because when people pull that off, it's really awesome. I did not pull that off. She said that this pacing does not work. The past storyline is not intense enough to keep up the pacing, and she just cut like 3/4 of the past timeline and make those flashbacks. And then because of that, I had to like redo my entire outline to accommodate that. But she was totally right. Like I can go back and look at the original rough drafts that I wrote and sent, and it's like, yeah, there was just a lot of padding in there as opposed to the final version where the flashbacks are thematically appropriate to when they pop up.
Is there a book that you're dying to write, but you haven't just yet?
Yeah, my book 6 on contract because it's due and I don't. Well, no, that's not true. I have an idea for that one. I am perpetually driven by fear. I think of fear of the industry passing me by, because people have asked me like, how did you put out a book every year? And it's like, I'm on deadline. I have to do it.
Fear and panic.
Fear and panic. Yeah. So
Yeah.
book 6. I'm finalizing a proposal and I feel pretty good about it. After that, I have no idea what I'm going to do. So that's the book that I dream about writing.
That's a good answer. I like that. All right. I'm not going to ask you this because I feel like you've had so many careers. Well, I guess I should ask it now that I brought it up.
Sure.
But what would you be doing if you weren't an author?
So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So because of my cost of living and my wife's need for medical insurance in the state of the United States healthcare system, I would have a corporate job no matter what. Like I could sell as many books as Neil Gaiman. I probably would still need health insurance. So that being said, I would probably do much more music in the evenings because I played in bands until I was in my early 30s, and when I decided to just like refocus on writing, so I would probably still be doing that. Like right now, I play music with my daughter, and like I'm teaching her guitar and stuff like that. But I'm obviously not playing in clubs anymore.
Are you a vocalist as well?
Yeah, I do guitar, vocal, keyboard, and bass if needed.
Have you ever started a novel manuscript and then made the deliberate decision to put it aside?
Oh yeah. I would say like the first 2 contemporary ones, 2.5 contemporary ones, they will never see the light of day. Though what's interesting, so the first one that I tried to write, this contemporary one, it was like very high Nick Hornby influence, and it was about a local musicians like playing like bar circuit. I look back on it now and there's actually really good characterization in there. There's really good dialogue in there. There's just absolutely no plot at all. And that's something that I really had to work with. Like early on, that was probably my biggest weakness. And so it's interesting now that I feel like structuring and outlining is one of my strengths. Like I can do it really fast and I know where to cut to make sure that the stakes are really high. But back then, like I had no idea. I just knew I had good dialogue. But everything that I've done, I try to save pieces of it if I need it later. So that first book about bands, there's both concepts and scenes that have been transposed into my upcoming book 5. I guess book 6 if you count Star Wars. Book 5 of my original stuff, except now there's vampires in there. So
just slightly different.
Yeah. So, but
I love
it. The vampire book, it's coming out in January. It's called Vampire Weekend. It's about a woman who, when she left her family in like the 70s, she just threw herself into like playing in bands and going to punk shows, and then she became a vampire, and like that's how she uses her immortality, but she's never dealt with like the trauma of her past because of it. So there's a bunch of different elements in there, but there's ideas from the band book that kind of just that she inherited. And I think that's really cool about anything that you write. It can always be repurposed or used as inspiration elsewhere, like even if the context is completely different.
Never wasted.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't cut anything. I paste it into a scraps document.
Do you keep a list of story ideas as you think of them?
Yeah, I have a spreadsheet that I use. I look at that and I think like, can this actually sustain into a concept? And that's where I'm kind of running into trouble with my next book, is that I have probably 5 or 6 good ideas, and I haven't figured out how to actually make them into a 3-act structure yet. They're just a cool log line right now.
Is there a writing book that you would recommend for aspiring writers?
Yeah, I love Save the Cat. Save the Cat is There's a novel version that came out like 2 or 3 years ago, but it was originally a screenplay book. It's 3-act structure broken up into like 15 beats or something like that. And when I was trying to figure out why don't I get structure, that really helped me. And one of the really cool things about the screenplay version is that there are examples in there of movies. And so you can just watch a 2-hour movie and digest it and look at how to deconstruct things, as opposed to a novel craft book where you have to apply it to like sitting down and reading, a whole book. It's a much more economical way of doing it. And it's also much easier, I think, because there's such an easily accessible library of, do I want a comedy or do I want to focus on action or romance or whatever? It's very accessible that way.
You've mentioned a little bit of advice so far, but do you have anything else that you would offer to writers just starting out? Any advice for those listening?
Yeah, so the other advice that I give, especially when I talk to high school and college writers, I tell them to write fan fiction. And the idea is that with fan fiction, your characters, your voices, your world building it's all done. So, and you can probably pull up like some form of media, whether it's like a TV show or video game or whatever, some moment from that media that can like reflect what you want to write. And so it's the ultimate learning tool because it's just this open sandbox where they give you all of the foundational pieces and you can just play around in it. Because I find that whenever I write anything original, that discovery process of the first draft is that's where so much of the work goes in. Like, who are these characters? And, outside of like the plot beats that like drive them forward, like how does that actually tie into their like internal lives? And with fan fiction, you just don't have to worry about that. Like, who these characters are. And the nice thing about the fan fiction community is you can post it and you can get immediate feedback that tells you like, did I do this right? So if you're working on like, let's say like you want to make sure that like you want to work on voice and like interpersonal conflict, you could write a fan fiction story about that and post it on AO3 or whatever. And within like a week, you will have people telling you like, I love this really worked for me. And it's because the voices rang really true. And so you will know that what you're working on really worked.
Now, you talked about having to work your writing around your job and your family.
Mhm.
Do you ever have days when you're just not feeling the muse? And if so, how do you handle that?
I would say right now I'm probably in like a burnout period. I had to basically write Star Wars and Vampire Weekend like in parallel and like in alternating sections. And it's not because of the material. Like getting into the material has always been and continues to be like really, really enjoyable. And I mentioned it's like a pressure release. It's more of the stress of like, how do I figure out this time when when my daughter's melting down and I have to get to this like day job meeting. So I'd say like any form of burnout probably centers around that. I told a friend that so I have line edits due for Vampire Weekend in like 2 weeks, and I'm pretty sure I can do it in like a week. And so I told a friend that I'm forcing myself to continue my break for all of March, where I play video games and watch TV. And she said, "That is uncharacteristically healthy of you." But I found that during this forced break, I did go back to my book 6 proposal that's actually due in June, and it's like 75% done. But like I was able to read it with fresh eyes, and like all these ideas came up about like, oh, I can make the characters more interesting here, or I can up the conflict here. And I think if I had been looking at it every day, I don't think like that fuel would be there. So there is really something to just forcing yourself to take a break.
Has anyone ever said anything discouraging or negative to you about your writing? And if so, how did it affect you?
I think the idea of imprints passing on stuff because it was too literary for sci-fi or too sci-fi for literary, that was pretty discouraging. And there is part of me that like when I have good news, I kind of think about the people in those imprints, not the creative people, because the editors always want to be. It was like the business people who, given this industry, like they may not even be there anymore. But I do kind of have that little bit of spite there. Creatively, actually, yeah, okay, so yeah, there is one guy who was in a critique group when I was very early on, and this guy did not understand voice at all. And I think about this guy quite a bit because he was very insistent in front of the entire group to point out that some of my sentences were not grammatically correct. And I was like, that's the character's voice. Like, that's how it goes. And he said, like, no one talks like that. I'm like, yes, they do. Think about our conversations. Like, we're using like run-on sentences and clips and things like that. And he just did not get it. But he went to the wall to protect his idea that he used a lot of alliteration in his sentences, in his adult historical fiction about the 1950s. uh, and like he was just so insistent that like it was really appropriate and really necessary to use alliteration in his sentences. And screw that guy. Like, yeah, I'm still bitter about him. He represents a lot of what I find when people don't progress. Because I'd say everyone that I started out with, they have all made it. Like they've all at least gotten agents, if not necessarily gotten published, but most of them have gotten published by now. And so they either made it or they said like, I don't want to put the energy into this anymore. I don't know anyone who's still querying and kind of like in that circle. They've always made progress, and they've made progress because they've been open to feedback and self like looking at themselves constructively. And this dude was just not that. Like he seemed to completely miss the idea of like being in a critique group.
We've all had experiences like that, I think, if you've been in critique groups. And the interesting thing is that same guy probably, if he's aware of all your success, resents it, but wouldn't have done what you did to get there.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Like I'm like my good critique partner, Sierra, like we had so many conversations about like, this is like 2008, 2009, trying to figure out why it felt like we weren't getting structure. Like, because that was like the feedback that we would get like when we were querying agents. It was like when we did get structure was like, I like these characters, but the story is not happening. And we're trying to figure out why. And she's actually the one who found the Save the Cat book. And like, we had to be honest with each other about like what is and what is not working. Why do I need to cut my first 3 chapters? That sort of thing. So like that sort of openness to feedback is just so important. And if you've got like a stubborn dude in your critique group, screw him. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Absolutely. Well, and it's like anything else, practice and
Yeah.
study and working it different ways, and eventually you hit your stride. But it just doesn't happen. I mean, for most of us.
Also, alliteration is not good in prose.
No, it's very distracting. What is the most gratifying part of being an author?
I think it really is just like when you get good reader feedback and it feels like it's something that affects them like on an emotional level, when you know that you've created something that will stick with someone for years. I think, it doesn't matter, whether it's one person or thousands of people, because I mean, like, we all read books where we're like, oh, that was cool, and then you kind of forget about it. But then there's also those books that you read, or movies or whatever, where it really sticks with you. It makes an emotional impact, and in some ways can change like the direction of your life. To get notes from readers who say that, I think that's probably the most gratifying thing.
All right. Well, this has been great. I have one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up with some
Sure.
fun extra questions at the end. But I am always curious to know: does your family read your books?
My wife listens to the audiobooks, which I found really weird at first. Oh, and my parents read it, and my dad sends me like critical notices about what he would do better.
Oh God!
Oh
Uh,
no.
if you follow me on Twitter, I publicly like deconstruct each of these every time it happens. So that's the only way I can
I'm
say
going to start following you on Twitter.
For
That's
sure.
awesome.
it. But yeah, my wife reads them, and I know like the first time she was my debut book, she said she was worried that she might hate it, and she's like, it has to be good because you got signed by a publisher, but she was worried. And she reads a lot of epic fantasy, so she doesn't really read too much stuff like I've written. Or like stuff within like the subgenre of like speculative fiction, but she'll usually tell me like what she really likes about it. And she it was nice with my last one. She told me that like she was listening to it, and she's like, I'm just upstairs listening to this crying, so good job.
Well, are you ready for our fun extra non-writing related questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Number one, what is one food that will never get past your lips?
I don't like a lot of cheeses, so I'm guessing it would probably be any sort of like really really stinky cheese.
Who would you want to play you in a movie?
Play me? There's not a lot of like notable Asian actors out there. So um, the joke among Asians is that like every movie should just star John Cho. And so there was a thing where they would Photoshop him into like different movie posters and like with the caption of starring John Cho. So I would say John Cho.
Okay, we'll go with him. What superpower would you pick given the opportunity?
I've been asked this question a lot because of writing a superhero book. And the answer that I've ultimately come down to is super speed, because I'm a very practical person. So with super speed, you could get all of your like home chores done very fast, and then you'd have more time to like, just enjoy yourself. So like instead of a few minutes to scoop the cat litter, it'd be done in like 2 seconds, like that sort of thing.
So
And
you get
also,
the flash.
it's exactly
That'd be awesome.
and the Flash will like read a book super fast because he can do that. So it's like I think about all the books that I could read faster and all the additional time that I would have because I don't have to worry about like dishes and things like that.
I think this is the 46th podcast we've done, and that's the first superpower we've heard. So that is cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus, I hate driving, and so if you could run really fast like the Flash, like it'd be faster and you'd also stay in good shape. So
You wouldn't have to worry about parking spaces or anything.
exactly, yeah. I'm very
What's
practical.
What's your biggest guilty pleasure?
Probably chocolate chip cookies. Like that's like the food that I can't resist. My wife knows that if she buys a pack of them, then like it's gone in a day. So I tell her like, please don't, because that's like the one thing that I can't resist, and it's not good for you.
What is the worst job you've ever had?
Ooh, I would say without naming names, I have liked different aspects of all the different jobs that I've had. Like even back when I was working retail in high school, a terrible boss can make it the worst job that you've ever had. And so when I was in the professional, like white collar world as a technical writer, I had a boss who micromanaged everything and would forget that they told you something, and then you do it, and then they'd be like, well, why did you do this? I'm like, because you told me to. And so as a group, what we started to do is like ask that these requests come via email, and then we would have like as a group we would collectively have like the evidence that we're not terrible people. So I would say like, that is probably the worst job that I had, mostly because of the way that it was managed.
If you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be?
becoming an expert at developing superpowers so I could learn to run really fast and get all my
That was tricky. What's your favorite smell?
coffee, black coffee.
Oh.
Like I love going into even just the Starbucks because they smell the beans being ground and it's the best thing ever.
What is the most terrifying thing you've ever done?
Well, I would say right now, I saw on Twitter that people were tagging me because they just got digital arcs of my Star Wars book. And for something that I love so dearly, to have like a personal creation in that, and it's like starting to be read by people, especially people I respect, that's pretty terrifying.
What's one thing you're really bad at?
Lying. People know when I'm trying to lie or dodge a question, especially my wife. I'm really bad at that.
Okay, and our final question, and it's the most important of all. If you could live your life over again, would you want to?
Yeah, it's what's funny about writing the stories that I do, because there's a lot about memory and identity and like paths not taken and things like that. I think there's always like a moment of like, if these hard or terrible things didn't happen, then like these good things or these good people wouldn't have happened. So I would say like, yeah, I probably would. I would try to change my attitude at certain times, but I'm totally fine with the way things played out.
All right. Well, we really thank you for taking time and wish you the best of luck with the new book.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Take care, Mike.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Book, brought to you by authors Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion. They hope you found it entertaining and informative. If you loved it, tell your friends. And if you have a moment, they'd love for you to post a star rating or review. This has been Behind the Book.